do we mean by that? Well, we look through history, we look around the world at history, and we notice a couple of reoccurring themes throughout every culture, throughout virtually every country. There are repeated stories. One of those repeated stories regards a massive flood. Another one of those stories, or one of those myths that come about, is the myth, so-called myth of dragons. And as this author has pointed out, we have this author here, is that several have also testified to the widespread nature of dragon legends. The famed 20th century evolutionists Carl Sagan noted the implacable mutual hostility between man and dragon as exemplified in the myth of St. George is strongest in the West, but it is not a Western anomaly. It is a worldwide phenomenon. Militant evolutionist and LifeScience.com staff writer Keir Than admitted dragons are found in the myths and legends of cultures all around the world. And a fellow named James Perloff wrote, the flood is not the only common remembrance of the world's culture. They also remember dragons from England to China. These were long part of national mythologies. The Indians of North America and South America had legends about them. They were written of in Ireland, France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Switzerland, Scandinavia, Ethiopia, Egypt, Persia, Russia, India, and Japan. So, okay, where did these dragon stories come from? And who cares? Maybe that's a better question. Who cares? This is after all a Bible class. Well, who cares? Well, the answer is, I think the answer is that we're going to be faced with the question. You're going to have this question or this issue presented to you that says, oh, look, everybody knows dinosaurs died out millions of years before the existence of man. Everybody knows that. Dinosaurs were gone. Dinosaurs lived, in the Cretaceous and the Jurassic and all those eras that were millions and millions and millions of years before man, and they all died out and they're all gone. And so we don't have to worry about that anymore. We can ignore them. Is that, and the question is then, is that so? Well, we can turn to a number of authors to look at this. It was interesting as I got into this because, as is usual with my Bible classes, when I got started on this, I ended up biting off a lot more than I could chew as I found out more and more information that's out there. There are texts from ancient writers, including Herodias, including Marco Polo, including Alexander the Great, and others who write about the existence of dragons. And you say, okay, well, that's all well and good. But what about the Bible? This is, again, after all, a Bible class. Why don't we talk about the Bible? What's going on with the Bible? Well, we're familiar with this passage probably over in Job, in the book of Job, chapter 40, verses 15 to 22. Now behold, Behemoth, which I made along with you, he eats grass like an ox. See, now his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the muscles of his belly. He hangs his tail like a cedar, the sinews of his thighs are knit together, his bones are like tubes of bronze, his bones are like bars of iron. He is the first in the ways of God, his maker brings near the sword, for the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus, in the hiding place in the reed of the marsh, and the lotus tree covers him with their shadow, the willows of the brook surround him. Behold, though a flood presses, he does not run away. He feels safe, even if the Jordan swells up to his mouth. Shall any take him before his eyes, or pierce through his nose with cords? Well, here we have this animal described in the book of Job called Behemoth. What is Behemoth? Well, if you've got your Bible, you might have maybe a reference Bible. My reference Bible in this passage here in Job 41 includes a little footnote. And it says that this is the hippopotamus. Anybody else got that in your Bible? You got a little reference there that this is the hippopotamus. And maybe you do. Maybe you got this reference that this is the hippopotamus. Is that so? Well, here's the hippopotamus tail. Actually, there are several hippopotami tails. They're lined up for us to examine. An author writing about this says, even if Ophir was renowned for its unique quality of its gold, the allusion to the Bible to cedars make it clear that the tree was distinguished for its mammoth size, height, and stability. Respected biblical lexicographer John Parkhurst alluded to its prodigious bulk. He goes on to say, there's again another picture of a hippopotamus tail. How intimidated would Job have been? What weight would God's argument have carried with Job if God compared the behemoth's tail merely to a twig or a branch? That's one of the arguments that's made about this passage here in Job, is that when God here references the bends his tail like a cedar, he's really talking to a branch. He's really referring to just a branch of the tree or a twig of the tree. And yet this fellow says, how can that be? You know, what sense does that make of this passage? It says, how powerful and effective would God's argument have been in Job's mind if God were referring merely to the tail of an elephant, a hippopotamus, a rhinoceros, or even the woolly mammoth? The argument would fall flat. An elephant or hippo's tail would be much better likened to a short, pliable whip or cord that swishes quickly from side to side, not the movement of a cedar when it sways slowly due to its enormity. Even the purpose of the hippo's tiny stump-like tail is hardly noble. The hippo's flat paddle-like tail is used to spread excrement, which marks territory borders and indicates status of an individual. So, I mean, there's, you know, and God says here in Job 41, or 40 rather, he says he bends his tail like a cedar. Is this the tail he's talking about? Is this what he means? And this author then goes on to suggest to us, speculate. Now, why are we doing this? Let me ask you, let me slow down for a minute. Why are we doing this? Okay? What's the point? What's the real point of all this? And may I suggest to you the real point of this, of all this, is as follows. Dinosaurs have become something of a proof, if you will, for the evolutionist. You know, here is the proof of millions of years of an Earth, billions of years, and animals millions of years, millions and millions of years to have the passage of time. And so their story is that, of course, the dinosaurs lived and conquered the earth, if you will, and then they all died out, and then here comes mankind afterward. And so, therefore, the account in Genesis cannot be correct that, you know, man was there with all the animals, because these animals were long gone before the account in Genesis. And so it is an attack, if you will, on our belief in what is written in the book of Genesis, and it is an attack, frankly, on the idea of creation of God, by God, of man and animal. And so we see kind of the one-sided story from the evolutionist that, you know, proposes, well, here's this fossil that's 65 million years old, or here's this dinosaur fossil that's 100 million years old, and so forth and so forth. And is there no counter story? Is there no counter argument can be made? Is there no counter evidence? And the answer is, well, yes, I think there is some counter evidence. Now, this fellow goes on to say, no, God had to be referring to a creature. Behemoth is a creature with which Job would have been familiar. It was so gargantuan and possessed such strength that even its tail was beyond human control. What other land creature on earth possesses a tail that merits being compared to a tree? And there is no creature except the dinosaur, according to this author. Diplodocus was an enormous-tailed giant measuring some 90 feet long with a 26-foot-long neck and a 45-foot-long tail. And so here is an animal that could fit that description, possibly, of Behemoth, as he's described in the book of Job. But you're kind of going, no, wait a minute. Let's go back to the original proposition. Let's go back to that original statement that says everybody knows that dinosaurs died out long, long, long before mankind came on the scene. Everybody knows that. You know, there was no coexistence of dinosaurs and mankind, right? Everybody kind of knows that, right? Well, here is a petroglyph taken from a place called Kachina Bridge. It's in the National Bridges National Monument in Utah. And what does that look like to you guys? It kind of looks like a brontosaurus, maybe. Now, you will find, of course, a considerable argument online about what this exact petroglyph is supposed to represent. But there it is, and so a lot of folks have looked at this and said, yeah, it looks like a dinosaur to me. It's dated between 150 BC and 1200 AD, 80 1200, and so it becomes that, that idea of how did the artist, whoever that artist was, make this drawing without knowledge of what he was without having any knowledge of what he was drawing. You'll find some considerable argument as the evolutionists will try to explain this away. They will try to explain that, oh, no, what you're seeing here is not one glyph, but multiple combined, and therefore it kind of looks like a dinosaur if you don't really pay attention. Well, other folks have looked at it and said, no, this is a singular glyph. This is a singular image. And so the argument will go back and forth. Anything else? Well, we've got something called an Ica stone. These Ica stones come from Peru. They were typically included with burial ceremonies. And there have been over 15,000 stones discovered depicting all sorts of things, various animals. How many of you have heard of the Nazca lines on the plains of Peru? Maybe some of you have heard of those Nazca lines. Well, these stones match the artwork, if you will. They match the artwork of the Nazca lines that were drawn. Now, the evolutionists will be quick to pounce and point out that, oh, look, a lot of these stones have been forgeries. Well, that's true, unfortunately. A lot of these stones have been forgeries, but a lot of these stones have been demonstrated to not be forgeries. And again, there's over 15,000. Why would anyone, the so-called argument is that this one single family began to forge these stones to sell to tourists, back in the 1960s, and they were forging these stones to sell. Well, 15,000 of them, they must have expected a pretty big crowd to come along if that was the case, if that was the truth. Notice what's depicted on this. You can see what's kind of depicted on here. We've got a kind of a brontosaurus-like type creature up front. We've got some sort of an upright Allosaurus perhaps there. It looks like eating a fish. You've got a Stegosaurus over to the right hand side. You got a Triceratops on the right with a pterodactyl above. Is this a forgery? And if it is, why put all that time into it? Why put all that time and energy into making something that is clearly a falsehood? Yeah. Pardon? I don't know. I have to admit, I don't know. They have done testing on a lot of the stones. They've looked for various. They do measurements of things like the patina on the stone, and they look for trace elements in the stone, showing what kind of tools were working the rock. And a lot of times on the older stones, of course, on the truly ancient ones, but these would be dated from around roughly 800 to 1200 AD, and they're saying that they find where these were worked with copper tools and things like that, as opposed to modern tools which would use steel and so forth. But yeah, on this stone, I don't know. I have to admit, I don't know if this was been proven to be an ancient stone or not. Well, thank you for mentioning that. Here's the Cabral, Mexico. I'll give you your money later. Yeah. Yeah, here's a Cambro, Mexico. And many of you remember we had Don Patton, Brother Don Patton here some years ago, who gave us a series of lectures, some very good ones, on some of the findings down in that area. And here were these over 33,000 stone or ceramic figurines have been found. And once again, the the evolutionists wave their hands and go, no, no, these are forgeries, these are frauds. These were all made by the locals trying to put these things out to entice the tourists and other visitors that would think that they found some real evidence of dinosaurs. But many of these, again, have been shown to be of ancient or very old origin. They found these figures, and they found them in poses that you would not normally find these kinds of animals in. Like, for example, this one that's upright. And I think Brother Don Patton even spoke to this to some degree about how these animals are in forms in that you would not normally present a dinosaur in a position. Yeah, I remember that. I remember that. Yeah, I remember that. That discussion from Brother Patton. Yeah, and they've got over 33,000 of these figures have been found. They were apparently used in some kind of a ceremony where they would bury them at the foot of a mountain for whatever reason, and they've been finding these things for some time. Like I said, again, the evolutionists have got to scream, all these are frauds, these are fakes, these are hoaxes. But the problem is that there they are. Here's one that's maybe a little tougher for them. This one is from this is from what's called the Top Prom Temple in Cambodia. It used to be Angkor Wat Temple. Used to be called that, and now it's called Top Prom Temple in Cambodia. This temple dates from the 12th and 13th centuries, and they know that. They know about when this temple was built. And there are all of these bas relief animals carved on the arches and doorways of this temple. And somebody noted this one. It's in the upper, that upper photograph there. They noted that picture there in the upper, and somebody goes, that looks familiar. And so, and sure enough, it kind of looks like if you look at what the modern representation of a stegosaurus looks like a very, very similar type of animal there that's being depicted. And so we might reasonably ask the question, are we certain that mankind never coexisted with the dinosaur? And the answer has to be no, we can't be certain, any more than the evolutionists can prove that dinosaurs all died out 65 million years ago. There is contradictory evidence. There's contradictory evidence on both sides about the age of these animals, and were they around in what we would essentially call modern times, within the age of man. Were they around? Yes. Well, the most current, most popular theory is that the dinosaurs all died out as a result of a massive meteorite that smashed into the area of around Cancun, Mexico, some, I want to say 50 million years ago? 65. Okay, I was close. 65 million years ago, this massive meteorite smashed into the earth. Would have been roughly, I think, a mile in diameter. diameter, maybe bigger than that. 6 miles. Okay. Yeah, I've drawn on my memory on this one. And yeah, so, and of course he created this cataclysmic uh, explosion, and threw enormous amounts of ejecta into the air, and as a result, it brought on the Ice Age, or an Ice Age, and the animals, the dinosaurs, suddenly found themselves in a colder, inhospitable environment, and they died off. And only the sort of primitive mammals were left, not just only primitive mammals, but primarily, the smaller creatures were left, and then they were able to continue on. And that tends to be the current thinking about where the dinosaurs all went. Again, though, we have historical writings. Not, we've got the Bible, of course. We've also, here is the Bible again about Leviathan. I couldn't find a lot about Leviathan, unfortunately, about the sea monster. Other than I would have us look at, Isaiah, where it is mentioned again here in Job 41. Let's start there. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Or will he make many supplications to you, or will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you? Or will you take him for a servant forever? Will you play with him as a bird, or will you bind him for your maidens? Will the traders bargain over him, or will they divide him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him, remember the battle, you will not do it again. Behold, your expectation is false, you will be laid low even at the sight of him. No one is so fierce that dares arouse him, and who then is he who can stand before me? And again, the description of this, or the supposition that we have for the Leviathan. Who is Leviathan? Well, verse 40, in here in chapter 41, my text gives a footnote that suggests, this was a reference to the crocodile. Well, again, some problems with that being the crocodile, because the question is, it says, 10, no one is so fierce that he dares to arouse him. Well, is that so? No, we know that the Egyptians were hunting crocodiles on the Nile during the time of the Old Testament. We know that the Egyptians were hunting crocodiles along the Nile. And so, are we talking about crocodiles here? Or are we talking about something else? And that's the question. What this gets down to then is, how old is the Earth? Because that's really the basic question. And why do we worry about that? Well, the problem is, of course, that the Earth is young. Then that kind of kills evolution. It kills evolution pretty well dead. If the Earth is old, it has to be billions of years old in order to make it all kind of fit to the evolutionary timeline that's been built. And so, as we're told, everybody knows that the Earth is 4.5 to 5 billion years old. But how do we know that? What's the supposition? Well, again, we'll look at some of these pieces, and some of them are like what Brother Patton has already spoken about when he was here before. If you remember those lectures. First of all, they look at, evolutionists will look at this geologic column, the time scale, and they'll look at the layers of rock, and they'll look at the fossils found within the rock, and to come up with, this layer's got to be this many years old, and this layer's got to be that many years old, and this layer's got this set of fossils in it, and this fossil was found in that layer, and therefore it's got to be this old. And so they come up, they look at these rock strata, and they find these formations around the world, and they estimate the age of these strata by assuming a deposition rate. How fast did that layer lay down? And then they refine the estimate based on fossils found in the layer, and they do some calculations, and lo and behold, they come up with, this layer's got to be 150, 250 million years old. Um, Problem with that from the young Earth viewpoint is that there's nowhere in the world that we find all the strata. That basically you have to kind of travel the globe and kind of they kind of make a lot of assumptions and piecing things together, and they build up a column that way. But it's all based on the supposition that all of these columns are can all be kind of piled up together, even though they come from different places around the world. Um, the deposition rates are often fairly crude guesses and are often demonstrably false. They make some assumptions about how fast things lay down. It's interesting that they'll make assumptions about how, at the rate of deposition, assuming that it's roughly constant over a long period of time, and yet if the young Earth people make that kind of an assumption, it's you guys are you're destroying science because you're assuming steady state. They use the fossil stage of rocks and then the rock stage of fossils, and so it's a tautology. It's a circular logic of figuring out, well, this it's this rock is this old because it's got this fossil in it. This fossil is that old because it's in this rock formation, and so you see that kind of circular logic building. One of the current techniques that's used that I didn't really pull any information in, but I could speak to briefly, and that is they're trying to use radioisotope analysis, and they'll say, oh look, we've got these isotopes that we found in this particular rock, and it's got this kind of chemical composition, and since we know the decay rates of the isotopes, and we know that they are just we believe they're constant over all time, then we can figure out that assuming that there was no of the essentially the parent of the daughter material in the initial rock, that therefore now we can measure forward and say, okay, now we've got these decay rates, and we find these products of decay, and we can calculate up an age. Well, a lot of problems with that. They assume, first of all, again, there's no daughter material to begin with, and second of all, they assume that decay rate is a known constant over billions of years. Again, a pretty good assumption. Another argument made on ocean salt. We all know that the ocean is salty, salt water. Well, how much salt should be in there? That's a good question. How much salt should be in the earth? Well, the old Earth, the evolutionists will say, well, those historic rates of salt input, or sodium is the chemical. Those historical rates of salt input or sodium input, they must have changed over time. And so sometimes the input rate would have been bigger, and other times the output rate would have been or smaller, and so forth, and therefore it could vary over time, and therefore we can't know. And then they'll also argue, well, huge amounts of sodium are removed during the formation of certain rock formations, and so that accounts for it. Well, the young Earth people look at it and say, no, we've got at current rates, some 450 million tons of sodium goes into the sea every year, and only about 27% of that is removed through natural processes. So over time, over millions and billions of years, you would expect to have a massive buildup of sodium in the water. If the seawater contained no salt, no sodium, and it accumulated at today's rate, then the ocean saltiness would be reached in only 42 million years, which is only 1/70th of the 3 billion years that the evolutionists claim. Okay, well, 42 million years, still a long time, but 42 million years still not long enough from the evolutionary point of view, to make evolution work. What else do we know? Well, we got the Earth's magnetic field, and we know the Earth's magnetic field has decreased in strength by about 10% in the last 150 years. The old Earth evolutionists will say, well, that magnetic field may fluctuate or even flip over time. We don't know that it's a constant rate of decline, and the geologic data suggests the Earth's magnetic field actually flips every 7,000 years. And so, maybe we're due for another flip. Um, well, again, like I said, when I started in on this study, I realized I'd kind of bitten off more than I could chew because there's just so much out there that you can find on all of these topics. There's just massive amounts. One of the better discussions I found regarding, and this touches on something Ronny has been talking about, and that is that they are teaching evolution as an established scientific fact. That evolution is a fact. Well, what do they mean by that? And the answer is, what they mean by that is they want to assert that there's no other reasonable explanation, and therefore they can cut off all discussion, all debate, all disagreement. That's what they really want to do. And the ultimate goal, and they have achieved it to a large extent, the ultimate goal is the exclusion, what they call exclusion of resources. And what we mean by that is, let us suppose that you wanted to go back to school and get a PhD in geology or paleontology. And you were to suggest that you were going to do so as a one who believes in creation. Where, would you be accepted to any of the major university programs? Would you be funded by anybody? Would you be endorsed by any of the professors? And the answer is no, you would not. The answer is no. They are. That disagreement is cutting off all debate to create a uniform thought process, if you will, that accepts evolution as if it were a fact, a provable fact, when it is not a provable fact. Certainly not macroevolution. Yeah. Right. Well, they'll the well, I know, and a good point. And the argument again is that they'll look at various rock formations and various especially iron formations, and they'll try and measure residual field strength within that material, and they'll draw a number of assumptions and conclusions about what the field strength has been over the course of time for that particular formation. It's kind of like, okay, but again, you have to make a lot of assumptions and a lot of suppositions to make it work. Oil and gas pressure. The argument there, we notice we've got oil wells, gas wells that are under a lot of pressure because they've got tons and tons of rock sitting on top of them. Well, the argument for the old Earth folks is that many of these formations are non-porous and they can hold pressure for millions of years, or some of the oil and gas pockets could be relatively new, with the idea that the Earth is creating new pockets of oil and gas. The point is, from the folks with young Earth, is that these oil wells, some of these are gushers. Oil and gas are under extraordinary pressure, and if the Earth were billions of years old, the gas and oil would have leaked through the rock a long time ago, and the pressure wouldn't be there. The real question again is, what is the point? What is the point of all this? And the point is that the evolutionists has got to have this very long time frame. They've got to have this very long time frame, and they have worked very hard, frankly, to convince folks of this very long time frame, and they want to stifle any argument that doesn't agree with them. Here was a writer in this text, Evolution: A Theory in Crisis. He says, admittedly, the length of time necessary for evolution by natural selection would have to be very great. As Darwin concedes in The Origin, the greater the length of time, the better chance of beneficial variation arising and of their being selected, accumulated, and fixed. However, the revelation of just how vast an amount of time had elapsed during the history of life on Earth was one of the major discoveries of the 19th century geology. Attempting to comprehend this immensity impresses the mind, as Darwin put it, almost in the same manner as does the vain endeavor to grapple with the idea of eternity. And so, yeah, if you have an eternity, if you have an eternity to deal with, you can make evolution work. You have a long enough time frame. That's the point here. If you have a long enough time frame, the undeniable capacity of organisms to undergo at least a degree of change, taken in conjunction with the vast time available, seemed to Darwin to greatly enhance the plausibility of his macroevolutionary claims. In an eternity, any degree of change might occur. And so, yeah, if you have all of eternity to deal with, you can make anything change. The bottom line, it gets down to this. Here is the scientist's nursery tale. In the nursery tale, in the standard nursery tale, the frog gets kissed by the princess and turns into a handsome prince. In the evolutionary nursery tale, the frog mutates over time to become higher and higher forms of life, and ultimately the frog becomes a prince through macroevolution. So that given enough time, we can get the same result that we get from the in the nursery tale from the princess's kiss. We get the same result through evolutionary process. Yeah. My own view is that it is in line with what they are teaching regarding secular humanism, and that is that man then becomes the current highest form of life. That there is nothing greater than man, and so in a sense, man becomes God. I think that in my view, the driving force behind evolution is to discount God, is to present an idea of how life got here and how man got here that requires no divine intervention or action. And so therefore we as human beings then become the highest form, and we decide what is right or wrong for us, and we are bound by no moral code other than what we create for ourselves. And I think that is the ultimate goal of it. I think that was the ultimate goal with a lot of those that embraced Darwinism initially. When someone pointed out that most of the time when a scientist proposes a theory, it is usually strongly examined and often does not survive its first incarnation. It often goes through several reiterations of theorizing to establish itself. And yet that was not so with Darwin. Darwin made his proposition, and it seemed like many seized on it as if it were the absolute truth of the world. And I still think, I do think, that a lot of that, the driver for that was just that there was a desire there or an interest there in being rid of the Bible, being rid of God, and moving him out of the way, so that again, man becomes the apex of the cosmos. Huh? Yeah, I ran away, kind of like the Tower of Babel. Well, I don't know about, yeah, I wouldn't say lower than animal. They would just recognize we are a highly evolved animal, and therefore, as a highly evolved animal, whatever behaviors we have, whatever instincts we have, are the result of, as they would put it, millions of years of evolution, and therefore, whatever those behaviors we might want to indulge in, we should go ahead and indulge, because after all, it's evolutionary. And I think it becomes an excuse to, like I said, remove God from the picture. All right. Well, thanks for your attention this morning, and I think Ronnie will be back next week.